the whole process a lot more, but it also would have been playing into a history of degrading these people in ways that's rather than helping them reach a state of equality and dignity and respect, ends up simply enshrining them in a second-class citizenship.
This is very interesting because this is really the emotional aspect of the conversation. To me, is to understand. Of course, words have meaning, and to me, this distinction, this fine line between our perception of another person and the fact that even if, let me present this question. Can we think of instances in which we, in our everyday discourse, use words that clearly mark distinctions between us that make it so that although we understand the foundational element that we are all the same, but there is still difference, right? And as a society, we understand that there is difference, but there is a foundational element of equality among us. But we still recognize differences, right?
Can you give an example of what you're talking about, maybe?
Well, I mean, for example, I have narcolepsy. I mean, I have a disease. There's this condition of who I am that is distinct from somebody else who doesn't have narcolepsy, right? Mm-hmm. Foundationally, I am, of course, a human. I am the same. I am equal to the other person. But at the same time, there is something very different in my situation than in theirs, right?
Right.
I mean, this is the same. I'm just giving an instance of how we use language as a means of conveying. We accept fundamentally we are the same, but at the same time there's enough nuance for us to recognize that we are still different.
Right, and I mean, what you give me to mind when you say that is a lot of like the literature in the disability rights community. They talk an awful lot about how subtle uses of language can disempower and marginalize people. For example, it's generally important to them to not refer to disabled people, but rather people with disabilities. It sounds like trivial, stupid, bullshit political correctness to a lot of people on the outside, but little things like that really can make a difference to the sort of lived emotional experience of people who are living with disabilities. I think. I'm hoping this sort of speaks to what you're saying, because I don't think people in the disabled community want to sort of ignore the fact that there are disabilities and that people have disabilities. What they want to do, though, is not be sort of fundamentally identified with their disability. They want to be seen as a human being first and foremost, and a human being with an impairment second, if even, or third, fourth even, possibly, depending on their personal priorities. Yeah, I mean, I think that at least part of what you're saying I agree with. We don't want to ignore the differences between people, because these differences do matter. And they matter in multiple ways. At the same time, though, that doesn't mean that we should place such an emphasis on these differences that it makes us ignore the underlying foundational similarities that we have. And language is tricky like that, because even if people are of good intention, they can accidentally use words in ways that divide people fundamentally rather than unifying them.
Right. I mean, we see this all the time on YouTube, right? I mean, it's fascinating to me is we certainly have no problem within discourse on YouTube with using language in a way that is extremely divisive, and certainly not in politics. We certainly don't have a problem with using language in a way that is extremely divisive. That is an us against them mentality. I mean, we have Democrats and Republicans and different political parties that are labeled they're labeled in a very distinct way, right? You go into a particular state and you identify as a Republican, someone may look at you. I mean, you don't see people sort of pushing to have one unified word. You know what I mean? Like, in other words, I'm just giving an instance here in which we understand the fundamental reality of people adopting various political perspectives, yet at the same time, there's distinctions between the two, and it is the distinctions that are in large part the label that we give to that person, not as a means of saying second class, albeit we certainly can use that in that way if we'd like, but as a means of recognizing the reality that yes, there is a distinction here. Yeah,
and there may very well be sort of good reasons for having minor differences between different sorts of relationships. I mean, we talk a lot about equality of the sexes. I mean, we generally accept the principle that men and women are equal, but we don't think that that means that they have to be treated equally across the board. Women have in their health insurance should have rights to pap smears and mammograms. I don't have that right in my health insurance because that's preposterous. There's a legitimate difference between men and women that accounts for that kind of difference. So, I suppose I'm open to the possibility that when it comes to gay relationships, there might be some sort of difference that can analogously create some sort of minor legal nuance or technicality. I can't think of anything off the top of my head that would be, but I'm not opposed to it. But I certainly don't think that that's going to be significant enough to justify, reserving even just the word marriage for this class and not the other. Yeah, I mean, the phrase here, again, it's the law demands treatment as equals, not equal treatment.
The law demands treatment as equals, right? Is that?
Yes. Treatment as equals, not equal treatment. And again, this is why disabled people can get like specialized parking. It's not because they are better people. It's because access for them is more difficult than for us, so their interests get a little bit more consideration when it comes to things like parking. So their treatment as equals might result in actual different treatment on the ground. But if this is a strategy that wants to be used to say that same-sex couples should be denied either civil rights in general pertaining to marriage or just the word marriage, a very, very sort of detailed and articulated case would have to be made in order to support that claim. And I have personally difficulty imagining how it could support such a massive and important difference.
Couldn't someone simply make the appeal that marriage has been in their culture and society one in which it has operated within the confines, the boundaries of a man and a woman, and there is an understanding in that culture and society that there is a very good reason for why it has operated within those boundaries of a man and a woman, primarily being, although not exclusive to, reproduction.
Yeah, I mean, people certainly make that claim. I mean, do you find that to be a compelling argument, or I mean, is that something that you're tempted by?
I think it can be a compelling argument. I mean, I certainly think that, for example, I was doing some, I read some articles, and one of the articles that I found to be of interest was, it was talking about how the number of births, the CDC had put out their census report for 2011, and they were talking about how the number of births that were taking place in America were primarily from a population group of minorities, ethnic minorities, and the ethnic minorities, who made up only 27% of the population, were actually having over 50% of the children in the country.
That's interesting.
And this, to me, presents a very interesting scenario in which if you have a culture that participates in American society and is having more children than anybody else, and those of us who are Americans are not having very many children,
These people are Americans, right? I mean,
they are yes,
still Americans.
yes, no, I apologize. I should be more careful with my language. They certainly are Americans, but this idea of well, one of the questions with regards to that stat is, of that 27%, how many of them are in married relationships, which brought me to a different article I read from the CDC, which says that about 50% of the children born in America as of, I believe it was last year, are born to unmarried women. Mm-hmm. So, to me, I'm curious to, to me there's this very interesting plight that is going on among minorities, and I think it's not just so much about being a minority as it is about being in a lower class socioeconomic status, because I think those two things are very closely associated.
Yeah, I would, as you bring out these sort of stats, I would be interested in seeing it broken down by socioeconomic standing. There are African Americans who are in the top 20th percentile. Are they how do they compare with European Americans, also in the top 20th percentile, versus African Americans in the lowest 20th percentile? Because I too suspect it probably has a lot more to do with socioeconomic status than race directly.
Right, but so this is my question though, is, and I guess this is some of the thinking that I was wondering about is, if in America we have a disproportionate amount of children being born in households where there isn't a mother and a father, and they're being born into lower income socioeconomic status, which we know comes with a huge list of potential problems with regards to being born in a lower socioeconomic status. And I wondered if someone can take these facts and say, you know what, we are going to emphasize marriage as a man and woman because we really want to combat this reality, because we understand that what's going to be in the best interest of our society is, one, that there is a father and mother in the life of this child, and then two, that these children are not being born in these. Obviously there's other issues to address, such as the challenges of the fact that people are dealing with these problems in these lower income.
So if I'm understanding you, the idea is that certain segments of the culture, or the culture at large, when they see that marriage is expanded to include same-sex couples, this either consciously or subconsciously creates in them a sense of the cheapening of the institution of marriage, so they're less likely to take it seriously, so they're less likely to get married, and more likely to have kids outside of marriage, and hence this is detrimental to those children. Is that the sort of the basic argument?
Wait, state that again. I'm sorry.
So it seems to be the argument that you're making, if I'm understanding it, is if we allow same-sex couples to get married, then certain segments of the populace, or the populace at large, will either consciously or subconsciously take the institution of marriage less seriously, and this will increase the likelihood that they will have children out of wedlock.
No, that's not. See, I would approach the argument from a different standpoint. Okay, what I would say is, because the way the way you approach the argument can make the burden more difficult on the person. So, in another way, it could easily be said, we're going to maintain marriage as between a man and a woman out of concern for the fact that we have a disproportionate amount of children being born to single mother homes without any support, and in lower income situations where they are being subjected to sorts of environments that are not in the best interest of our society. To help. So,
wouldn't one simple or partial solution to this be to allow homosexuals to get married and facilitate them in the adoption of children from these these poor segments of the society. Wouldn't that help? I mean, that seems to be I mean, obviously it's not going to be a magic bullet, but certainly, if you are talking about, however much, somewhere between 5 and 10% of the population being gay, if at least half of those people want to be in committed lifelong relationships and want to raise children, that's about a few million children right there that you could take out of single parent homes if they're willing to give them up for adoption and put them into sort of better off, more stable, loving environments. I mean, isn't that a
yes, certainly. I mean, we could think of, I think, a whole host of improvements that could be made, and we could certainly say that emphasizing marriage between a man and a woman, and the fact that we have these challenges here in America, and having them adopt would be a very significant improvement. I mean, so it's interesting. Someone posted it here in the comments. How is same-sex marriage threatening to straight marriage? And that's not the argument here. The argument is not that allowing for gay marriage is somehow threatening to heterosexual marriage. The argument is there good reason to leave marriage as being between a man and a woman and not allowing?
That's the question.
Yeah, I mean, but that's I mean the question, which is the argument at hand, is are there good reasons for it? I mean, and I think that there's something to be possibly to think about there. That yes, there are good reasons for us to maintain marriages between a man and a woman, not because homosexual marriage or the adoption of homosexuals into that term is somehow threatening to heterosexual marriage, but rather given the challenges that we are facing in America, it's in our best interest to promote marriage as being between a man and a woman and not extending that out to being more inclusive.
But what is the, I mean, what, can you articulate that final step there? What is it about promoting marriage as being between one man and one woman that will have a sort of practical, actual effect in the real world that will be in any way detrimental to these children? So the mechanism for me, if you will.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, because the reality is when we look at American society, there's certainly been, they've certainly had plenty of time to use marriage in that way. They've certainly had we've certainly had plenty of time in American society to emphasize marriage and how important it could be, but we obviously haven't. So.
And the degradation of it, of the institution of marriage, doesn't seem to really have had anything to do with gay people or gay couples. I mean,
no, I agree. No, I completely agree. I'm just, like I said, I'm just tossing out some ideas.
You might be interested to know. I mean, I'm not sure if it's quite the same point that you're making, but if I recall, the State Supreme Court of New York, and Mitch, if you're still around, you might be able to. Yes, you are still around. I can see. You might be able to speak to this if I'm recalling correctly. I want to say it was in 2005 they had a ruling, and they ruled at that time against gay marriage. And I read the rationale, and I got to say, it really kind of puzzled me. And it seemed to be like what they were saying was that because gay couples were, on average, more economically well off and sort of more emotionally stable and responsible compared to straight couples, that by recognizing gay marriage somehow this would shame straight couples or something like that, that they're not as good as the gay couples, and therefore the state has a compelling interest in recognizing only straight marriage. And it seemed at the time like such a preposterous argument. I'm not sure if I'm remembering it correctly or if I'm summarizing it fairly. So, Michigan, I don't know if you want to confirm me any of that, if that's at all roughly, if I got it roughly right. But if that is at least sort of roughly something like what you're saying, then you are at least in good company. At least for a time, the Supreme Court of the State of New York said something somewhat similar. But at the same time, they reversed their decision eventually, and I think most legal scholars, I think, would probably agree that the reversal was right. Yeah, like I said, yeah, Mitch is saying I think the court was trying to do is push the matter to the legislature, which I guess they did. So, I mean, I suppose then, you know, to cap this particular point, obviously the New York courts never reversed themselves out. Thanks for that clarification. If this argument to work, for this argument to work, at a minimum, you would have to articulate sort of precise mechanism of how it ends up being detrimental to children. There's the vague specter of, you know, we have to think of the children is really not sufficient. In fact, I think there's at least some evidence to think that it actually goes the other way around. You know, I've seen some studies. I'm obviously not an authority on this. I'm not a social scientist, so I don't want to put too much weight behind it. But I have seen at least some studies that suggest that, on average, gay couples tend to be better parents than straight couples. Not because about anything about them being gay, but just because they generally have to adopt, and that, you know, requires much more deliberate effort, which makes it more likely that they'll put more thought into it and be more ready to be parents when it happens, as opposed to straight people who very frequently have children by accident and maybe not when they're ready and end up not being terribly great parents. So
well, and so my question though there is, and when you look at what you just presented though, is that looking at the fact that, is that looking at the parents who are having those children out of wedlock, you know, those children, single parent homes, or is that looking at the parents who are married? I mean, you know what I'm saying? Like, I think that
I think it's averaging for everything and controlling only for you know, gay couple versus straight couple. So the population of straight couples they look at will include emotionally stable, financially stable, married committed couples, but it will also include the single parents and stuff like that. And no doubt the poorer and the single parents will sort of drag down the overall average for the straight couples.
Well, when you consider the fact that the people who are in lower income situations are having a disproportionate more amount of children than the rest of the population. I mean, I think, how is it that, I mean, how do you go about evaluating? I think it's a little bit more, I mean, and I'm sure, you sort of stated that it was, but...
But I suppose, you know, one way of framing the point here is that we've got better reason to deny poor people the right to have children than we do to have gay people have the right to have children. And to be clear, I'm not saying we deny the right to have children. But if this is the line of thinking that we're going to take, you know, we should refrain people who we have good reason to believe will be less capable parents from having kids. That is a better argument against poor people than it is against gay people. So if we're not going to accept that argument against the right for poor people to have kids, then it doesn't seem like we can accept it against gay people.
Right, and I'm not, and like I said, this is more an argument for why marriage should be between a man and a woman as opposed to extending out to become more inclusive. So, I mean, I guess necessarily that becomes an argument against gay marriage, but it's not specifically focused on countering gay marriage, right? It's not looking specifically at the potential healthiness of gay couples. It's looking at this idea of a man and a woman and the potential for them to have children.
Mm-hmm.
Which, I mean, something that obviously gay couples can't have. I mean, unless not naturally.
But lots of straight couples can't have it either. I mean,
that's true.
You know, some people are sterile. Some people have tubal ligations or vasectomies.
That's true. There are exceptions. I mean, certainly. I mean, and obviously those aren't the people who aren't having the children isn't the concern now. I mean, the problem now is, I think the concern now is people having children who aren't in marital relationships. So, I guess.
And maybe there are things that we can do to sort of address that and combat that in some sort of broad cultural fashion or something like that. You know, better birth control is the first thing that comes to my mind, and better access and education about it. But if we're looking at this as a problem, it seems to me that the solutions that you're going to find really are going to have little to do with gay marriage.
Well, okay, but can't that be the argument though? In other words, it's not the argument being presented is not that I need to address the benefits or disadvantages of gay partners. the argument is marriage should be left between a man and a woman because this as an institution is largely one that encourages procreation in a natural way that we as a society find to be very beneficial. And currently this is something that is not occurring very frequently.
Well, I'm not sure that it's the you say procreation in the natural way. I'm not sure that's especially what we value in our society. I mean, certain segments of society, certainly, Catholics in particular, very much about natural procreation. But I think, America as a whole, I'm not sure that's really what we care about. I think what we care about is, sort of loving, committed households, stable, supportive families, and that's not something that seems to me to be exclusive to gay or to straight couples.
And let me just clarify, folks, you're right. I am not presenting good reasons against gay marriage because I'm not arguing against gay marriage. You see, the approach is not one in which I have to present counter reasons against gay marriage. What I'm presenting is, one, not a position that I actually take. This is really just to engage in some thoughtful discussion with Sisyphus Garrett here. I'm presenting reasons for why marriage should remain as is between a man and a woman. That's what I'm presenting. It's not. So if you want it to be, if you came here and you were hoping for me to bash gay marriage, you're not going to get that. If you were hoping that I was going to provide you some solid arguments for why gay people can't get married, you're not going to get that either. What I'm presenting are ideas regarding why one may want to argue that marriage should be left between a man and a woman. If you can't figure out the distinction between the approach, then you're going to frustrate yourself more than anything, all right?
Well, let me ask you a question from the other. Are you familiar with the idea of covenant marriage?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I heard down south in Louisiana they passed legislation regarding that. Like you have to have 6 months of premarital counsel or something, and you can't get a divorce without having like a year of premarital, something like that.
Yeah, it obviously it can take different forms, but the general idea is to make it much more onerous to enter into and to exit the institution of marriage. And it's a proposal I find quite interesting because it seems to me that the people who put that forward really are taking seriously the idea of the importance of marriage and the importance of trying to shore it up. And I think there's obviously problems with it, especially if like abuse is involved in the marriage or something like that. Then that making it harder to get out would be a very, very bad idea. But at the very least, the people who advocate this, I think, cannot be accused of using their concern for marriage simply as a tool for bigotry against gay people. They clearly are committing themselves to attempting to solve this problem in other ways as well. So I don't know. I suppose I'm curious if you have any opinions on it, one way or the other.
No, I think that is a great approach for people to take, and I've seen this happen a lot in the churches that I've served at over the years. Is they have said, look, if you want to get married, there's going to be 3 months, 6 months of premarital counseling, and in the midst of that premarital counseling, they of course discuss issues regarding sexual relationship, intimacy, how to handle conflict, all of these issues that by and large, to be quite, and this is sort of a digression, that I don't believe our society really prepares us for being able to handle. I think given the dawn of technology especially, a lot of us are really inept when it comes to social interaction and communication and learning how to handle conflicts in a healthy way. So I love the fact that there are more churches that are basically saying, look, the institution of marriage in America is crap right now. We're largely to blame, but even though we're largely to blame, we don't want to extend it out to become more inclusive of other ideas of marriage. Instead, we really want it to remain the same and for us to sort of fix this problem, because in the long run we believe that the man and the woman, the husband and the wife, and the potential for most of these married couples to have children is something that is ultimately going to be of benefit to our society.
Well, I don't know. I mean, there's a separate debate as to whether or not bringing children into the more children into the world is a sort of a good idea at all. I mean, we have something of a world population problem, and so I think an argument could be made that actually discouraging procreation might be a better idea rather than encouraging it in any context, whether within marriage or without. But I suppose that's a topic for another day.
Yeah, because that's a good point. But yeah, would I rather have more people? But to me, I would rather see more children. In other words, if we saw twice the amount of children being born because all of a sudden married couples decided to have children, and they actually have more children than single parents have children, especially single parents who are in lower socioeconomic status, and it's not just that, but obviously it's the question of what sort of environment are their children being raised up? Is it a safe, healthy place where education can be nurtured and where they have access to a lot of things? And I mean, there's a lot to talk about there, but I would rather see more children being brought into the world from married couples who take marriage seriously, as opposed to, in other words, I don't think us saying, hey, everyone should have less children is actually that great of an idea necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think that's a topic possibly for another day at any rate. But I suppose when I keep coming back to with this line of thinking is, I don't see how any of this really, I mean, supports the idea that we should not expand marriage. And if our sort of ultimate, I mean, again, this is sort of an overused tactic, but I think it's a fair one. I mean, if we were to rewind this conversation to early 1960s, late 1950s, it seems like someone could have said this exact same thing against the idea of legal recognition of interracial marriage.
Could they really? I mean, is it exactly the same though? I mean, obviously it's not exactly the same.
Yeah, it's not exactly the same, but certainly someone could make this point.
Well, yeah, I mean, they certainly could. I mean, in the same way, someone could bring up points that you addressed in your video regarding polygamy, pedophilianism, and bestiality. They certainly could make points for all of those, but it's not the points of similarity that are the issue. It's the significant differences.
Right. So what then would be the difference? Why is it a bad argument against not allowing interracial marriage, but at least potentially a good argument in favor of not allowing same-sex marriage?
If someone, for example, approaches marriage from the standpoint as I've presented, as being beneficial for society, because by and large, the husband and the wife have the potential, most of them have the potential of having children, then it would be ridiculous to exclude a husband and a wife simply based upon skin color. Because, well, they meet those, they meet the sense of why marriage is very important for our society. It's very important for our society because we understand that children being brought into the world in which there's a husband and wife and they have their offspring, there is this very strong, powerful connection that is of great interest for our society to maintain. I mean,
but if that's our sorting, then I mean, then I think we're back to the issue of what about sterile straight people? I mean, if someone's on record man's on record as having a vasectomy, mm-hmm. We know that he can't have children. If he's not meeting this central criteria, why couldn't we exclude that person from getting married? Why shouldn't we exclude that person from getting married? If that's ultimately what marriage is about, is this raising of children thing?
Well, I think that what the argument could be is the government is not going to go about trying to figure out who can and cannot necessarily have children. I mean, and I certainly think that perhaps the problem is with the word marriage is that fundamentally the difference between the interracial component versus the gay marriage component is the interracial component neglected the very foundational element of it being between a man and a woman. So they extended it out.
That seems kind of question begging. I mean, you can't say that being between a man and a woman is a foundational element without assuming that that's going to be sort of the key point here.
Well, yeah, I think the key point is multiple. It's not just simply that it's a man and woman, but it's that they were man and women, and that by and large it's understood that men and women in the context of marriage, when they have children, knowing that most can, is going to be of great benefit for a society and culture for obvious reasons, such as, I mean, if you're living out in Podunkville and you don't have children, well, I mean, you're going to die off, right? Your civilization, your culture, the ideas and philosophies and mindset that you believe to be so important and true are going to die off.
Yeah, we need to have children to perpetuate both the species and the culture, right? I certainly agree with that, and I agree that that's important. But at the same time, again, why shouldn't we then prohibit sterile people from getting married? I mean, why does the fact that straight people in general can procreate make any difference at all if we know there's a certain segment of the population, I don't know, maybe like 10%, just to pull a number out of thin air. If we know that 10% of the population is sterile, that's a whole bunch of people that we could preclude from marrying since we know they failed to meet this criteria.
No, certainly. I think there's that's a good point. I mean, and how that could be addressed, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, it's possibly it might just deal with. I mean, because once again, we're talking about. I mean, if we're talking about the sort of argument being presented for a secular society, one could say that given that we know by and large this is the case for these individuals, we don't find that these 3 to 5% of the population who happen to be sterile to be of a significant issue. Or if anything, even if we do, then certainly we could encourage that sort of population to adopt in situations which we need that.
And couldn't we then do the same thing with gay couples?
Well, you could do that same thing with a lot of couples. You could do that same thing with a whole host of different relational models. So it's not a question of whether or not different relational models can accomplish the same task of adopting. It's a question of whether or not one can present a compelling reason for why a society and culture should emphasize and make exclusive marriage as between a man and a woman.
Right, but it seems to me that if the argument is that it's about procreation, marriage is about having children, then we should be focusing on couples that can have children, not gay versus straight couples.
Well, I don't think that social contract, that legal contract is simply about procreation. I think that legal contract has far-reaching implications beyond just procreation. I mean, obviously, like you had mentioned before, we're talking about a relational model that is much more nuanced than simply procreation. It's a model regarding how these two individuals go about and engage in whatever, I don't know.
So, I mean, it seems to me that you're wise to say it's not just about procreation, because it's pretty clear it's not just about procreation.
It's not.
Marriage is about more than that. But at the same time, unless you can draw a real difference between gay marriage and straight marriage that has something to do with other than procreation, then the only real concrete difference, it seems, is precisely that one is procreating and one is not. So if procreation isn't what makes the difference, then we're not going to be able to draw a line between straight couples and gay couples.
Well, it's not just that. I mean, the society can recognize, well, given the makeup of these two individuals, a male and female, they can say that we recognize that from a naturalistic perspective that these bodies, by and large, are composed in such a way that they we have compelling reason to believe that this is not we don't have a problem with this sort of expression being endorsed, not just because we understand the potential for them to have children, but because, in other words, it's not just one element. I think that there are several elements that, when combined together, can make for a non-religious reason for why someone might say marriage should remain between a man and a woman.
That's, so other than procreation, what are some of the other elements?
Other than procreation, I think that there can certainly be a sense of I mean, the question is how do we conceive of marital relationships now? I mean, when we look at heterosexual married couples before before the topic of same-sex marriage, were married couples simply conceived of as being people that could procreate, and that was the only significant value that was placed on it? I think that was probably a large driving factor for that legal contract. And I'm pretty sure, I mean, it seems to me that that's a huge fundamental reason for why a secular society would create such a contract and emphasize such a contract, understanding that it's in their best interest for that to be made, regardless of whether or not there's a small percentage of that population who may not be able to do so. They're not concerned with the exception to the rule so much as they are with the rule.
Right. But why can't the rule be consenting adults should be allowed to marry? Gay people are an exception to that rule, but we're going to turn a blind eye to it. Like Mitch mentioned a second ago, if his figures are right, about 10% of the population is sterile, and about half of that is gay. So it's a larger exception to turn a blind eye to sterile people than it is to turn a blind eye to gay people. So,
well, once again, though, if it's not so much about whether or not gay people can be good parents, whether or not they can adopt, whether or not they can be healthy citizens, whether or not they can enter into relational models that are of benefit for society. They certainly can. As can my friendships with other people. My friendships with other people, same and opposite sex, are a very significant benefit. But by and large, I think a driving difference that a secular society understands is intrinsically important to them maintaining the truths and ideologies that they believe to be important is procreation. And procreation in a context where the context of a marital relationship. Like, we understand that to be of significant, great importance, such that even though there are exceptions to this rule, this is not something that we would feel comfortable with expanding to others. This is not to say, as some people are wanting to say, this has nothing to do with gay people or whether or not they have, they can be good parents or discrimination. This has nothing to do with that. If you think it has something to do with that, you're not listening to the argument being presented right now. I'm not arguing against homosexuality or gay relationships. That's not what the discussion is.
Right. I think I can sort of see that, but I think there's at least a partial consequence of what you're talking about. If we are going to say that society has an interest in promoting heterosexual marriage, then a consequence of that will be precluding gay people from getting married.
Yes, the consequence, right. I mean, obviously, if a society says we find good reason for us to have marriage be between a man and a woman, then obviously that excludes any other relational model. That is not to make a judgment about other relational models. It's to say that they are different. That it's to say that as a society, here's what we want, here's what we think is important. It's not to say that you aren't important. It's not to say that your relational model isn't important to our society, just like my friends aren't important to society. Sure, friendship and trust between me and my friends who are of the same or opposite sex is extremely important, but I'm not going to turn back to the government and say, look, you're discriminating against me because you have set up this criteria of what is in the best interest for a society, primarily being procreation, and I can't do that, so you're discriminating against me. I just don't see it like that.
I don't know, I mean, that kind of sounds to me like, again, I'm thinking in metaphors here, but I can imagine, you know, when we were debating whether or not to let African Americans vote, for example, I can imagine someone coming along and saying, look, I'm not saying that African Americans aren't important, that their voice doesn't matter, that their opinion doesn't matter, but you know, we as a society have recognized that there's a certain way that we do things, and there are certain values that are promoted by only allowing this select group of people to vote. So while we respect you and we care about you and we want to recognize you as people, we're going to not prevent you. We're going to prevent you from voting because of the sort of institutional inertia and the way we sort of set up this society.
Well, look, you know, here's the thing, Garrett. Like, you bring that up, and that's fine. And this is common because it makes an appeal to a historical issue that today we all clearly look back and say that was wrong. We all do so, but I think there's very clear distinctions between back then and the wrongness of that versus what's going on now. There is a fundamental difference in my mind between what's being argued for now versus what is going argued for then. But here's the thing: is even if not, we as a society still have decided who we are going to discriminate. It's not, let's not fool ourselves into thinking that we don't discriminate. We certainly do. We certainly create boundaries and limitations of these models of relationship in our society. And there are people who are excluded from that, and these people believe they have very compelling reasons for why they should be allowed to be in those sorts of relationships. But we as a society say to them, you know what? No, we care about you, we think that you're a good person, but no, we're not going to recognize that sort of relational model. Because why? Because that's not in our best interest.
Right. And
so, I mean, we do that all the time. So it's not
yeah, and I agree that sometimes when we do that, we are in the right to do so, and other times we're in the wrong. And you have to sort of look at each individual case by case sort of scenario to determine where you're right and where you're wrong. But the question, God, I'm sorry, this troll is just really starting to get on my nerve. It keeps coming back. Hang on. There it is. So what it boils down to then for our discussion is, can we articulate specific reasons for this particular case, for saying that with respect to the institution of marriage, we have good reasons for emphasizing, promoting, focusing on privileging straight marriage to the exclusion of same-sex marriage. And I mean, so far, I mean, I'm trying to sort of enumerate the reasons. The closest I've heard sort of a clear, specific reason is the argument of procreation. But for reasons that we've already discussed, that doesn't seem to me to be a terribly good dividing line, because it doesn't distinguish what matters from what doesn't matter. If that really was a dividing line, it would be promoting procreative marriage against non-procreative marriage. It's not promoting straight marriage against gay marriage.
Hold on one second, please.
You want anything? From Robin.
From where?
Red Robin?
You can give me the grilled chicken sandwich.
Yeah, and can we use your car?
I don't care.
We can use your car?
I don't care.
Yeah.
All right. The clear divide